welcome you all to our third session of the 2023 Academic Writing Workshop on getting your work published in international academic journals. This event is organized in collaboration between the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, known as IFIS, and Henry Luce Foundation. And today, I am Pinkani Poluan, will be your host as well as your moderator for the next hour. All to our third session of the So everyone, as you may know, this workshop is created to provide Indonesian scholars with information about publishing in highly ranked English language academic journals. The goal of workshop is to help researchers, which also including me, to prepare manuscripts by gaining more insight as to what editors look for when reviewing paper submissions, how to construct a clear and effective argumentation, what it takes to produce a qualified manuscript, among other things regarding publishing in international academic journals. So I believe you're all very excited for this insightful workshop, as I am too very excited. And before we commence our online session today, let's go through some important housekeeping guidelines to ensure a smooth and productive experience for everyone participating from the comfort of their own screens. I believe we are all familiar with these guidelines. I would like to point out several points. We encourage active participation from all of you. So please feel free to post your question using the chat box, or you can also use the raise hand feature to indicate that you want to ask a question. And please note that this workshop may be recorded for future reference or for those unable to attend. By participating in this online event, you are agreeing to the possibility of being recorded. And if you do not wish to appear or be heard, please disable your camera or microphone. Thank you. I believe that you had a highly advantageous and practical session on the second session last week with Paul and Susan Nerney. I'm sure this third session will be as fruitful as the last sessions. So without further ado, let us start the third part of the series. I assume that all of you have watched the video thoroughly, because we are joined now with our esteemed expert. Thank you for being here with us, Siddharth Chandra. And unfortunately, Micah is running a little bit late because of traffic. I guess we are all in Indonesia, in Jakarta especially, are familiar with traffic jam, but he will surely be joining us soon. But for now, I would like to introduce Siddharth briefly to get to know him better. Siddharth Chandra is Director of the Asian Studies Center and Professor of Economics in James Madison College at Michigan State University, as well as past president of the IFIS. Prior to joining Michigan State University, he was director of the Asian Studies Center and associate professor of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. And before we proceed to the question and answer session, Siddharth, maybe you have some remarks to tell to the audience, I guess.
Thank you so much, Pinkani, for your kind introduction. And good morning. I think for most people, it's good morning. For a few people, it may be good evening back in the US. It's a pleasure to be here. As Pinkani said, I hope you had a chance to watch the recordings. I think Micah has entered the room, if I'm not mistaken. But let me just say a few words. The videos, again, this may be a little redundant if you closely watch the videos, but the videos both focus on very important aspects of academic writing. The first video focuses on argumentation and how to make your point when you're trying to have a conversation in absentia with reviewers and with an editor of a journal. And the second video focused a little bit more on once your article has been submitted to a journal, and if you are fortunate enough that it's not immediately rejected and you actually get reviews from reviewers, then how to respond to what the reviewers have said about your paper. So, we have a relatively limited time. We have robust attendance here. Presumably you have questions. So I'm going to hand the mic back over to Pinkani, but welcome. It's a pleasure to be here and we look forward to having a discussion.
Okay, thank you, Professor Siddharth. I think we are now with Dr. Micah already.
Ya, selamat sore, selamat pagi.
Selamat pagi in Indonesia, Dr. Micah. Okay, so before we...
Mohon maaf terlambat, terjebak macet.
Tidak apa-apa. Okay, let me introduce you for a little bit, so everyone knows you a little better. So Dr. Micah Fisher is a fellow in the research program at the East-West Center. He conducts research on the human dimensions of environmental change, such as deforestation, land degradation, and urbanization in the Asia-Pacific. Recent research has focused on deforestation, land rights, and tenure policies in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, disaster risk, vulnerability, and water insecurity in Greater Jakarta, agrarian change and livelihoods in Sulawesi, and technologies of participation. He is an affiliate graduate faculty at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Hawaii, and lectures in the Department of Forestry at Hasanuddin University in Indonesia. He currently serves as co-editor-in-chief for the academic peer-reviewed journal Forest and Society. Okay, so with that being said, I'm now opening the Q&A session. For all the participants, please feel free to post your questions using the raise hand function feature, or you can also type your questions in the chat box to indicate that you would like to speak or ask questions. I think we're still waiting for the questions. Yeah, I think I have one question already now. From Elizabeth. She has two questions. The first question is, if a paper was rejected, but the reviewers gave comments and suggestion to improve it, can I submit it to the same journal after 1 year? And I will just proceed to the second question. The second one is, I collaborated on the research with 3 more colleagues from different universities. In our methodology section, we mentioned that we recruited participants from our institutions. Is that okay? Provided that the readers would be aware of which institutions we were talking about. I think Professor Siddharth or Dr. Micah, which one of you would like to answer first?
So I can start with the response to the review. I think your decision about whether to submit your paper to the same journal that rejected it will depend on what the content of the review itself is. Sometimes the review may say that this paper is not a good fit for our journal, right? And that means your paper is just not a good match. It may be the best article in the world on whatever it deals with, but it doesn't fit with what is in the journal, okay? If you presumably watch the presentation, and one of the things I mentioned in the presentation was the journal editor is looking for fit. The journal editor, when they look at your paper, is saying, who's going to read this paper? Who among my subscribers would want to read the paper, right? And when they write back saying this is not a good fit, basically they're telling you that the topic of your paper is such that my readers, the readers of my journal, probably are not going to be interested. Okay, so if that's the kind of feedback you got, I would not send it back to that journal. If the feedback you got was more of a technical nature, here are some problems, and you believe you can fix those problems and it will strengthen the manuscript significantly, then I think there may be a case to be made for submitting a paper back to that journal. I have never done that myself, but I have been a co-author with a colleague who has done that on 2 occasions. On 1 occasion, the paper got accepted. The second time we sent it, the other time it did not. So, it's a judgment call. But I think these are some factors that you should think about.
Thank you, Professor Siddharth. Dr. Micah, do you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add. I think that was a very comprehensive response. I think a rejection means that they don't want to publish it, but if it's significantly different, you can resubmit it. I think the question is probably more related to why I'd be curious why you would want to submit it back to that same journal. So I think for all three of these questions that I'm seeing, the answer is kind of it depends. So a little bit more context is important. If you need to publish to that journal and you have a good reason for doing so, and you've already addressed the comments from the reviewers, it's possible to resubmit there. But a rejection is a clear kind of, assessment about fit for that journal. I don't, for the second question, I don't, can you clarify a little bit? I'm not really clear.
Okay, she mentioned that she is writing a paper, collaborating with 3 more colleagues from different universities. And they mentioned that they recruit participants from their institutions. Oh, okay. I think I would need Elizabeth, maybe if you want to restate the questions so it will be more understandable or easier to be understood. Please present your second question. And while waiting for that, I think we have Mbak Nadila Puspa who would like to ask the questions. You may now ask the questions.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mbak Pinkani. Good morning, Prof. Siddharth and Dr. Maika. I am Nadila Puspa from Universitas Gadjah Mada, Indonesia. So I would like to...
Which department?
Department of Agricultural Socio-Economics and Faculty of Agriculture. So I was submit my articles in a journal for about 9 months ago, but they haven't sent me the status is still submitted. There is no reviewer until today. So can we actually, as an author, send them a list of potential reviewers for them? So I think maybe the review process might be can be done sooner, because until today my paper is not reviewed yet. But in this case, this journal is not actually mentioned in their website that they need suggested potential reviewer. Can we do that to them? Thank you, Prof. Siddharth and Dr. Mike.
So, so first of all, 9 months is a very long time for your paper to not have gone out for review. When I submit a journal article, I typically, the day I submit it, the day I hit the return key in the submission portal, I mark my calendar for maybe 1.5 months, maybe 2 months out. And I put a reminder there saying, remind this journal that you have a paper with them, right? So one thing I recommend to everybody, especially all of you, because most of you are early career scholars, you probably are under some pressure to publish. Time is very precious. Make sure that your paper moves along through the process at a rapid rate. Yeah. So that's kind of a side comment, but it's something that I've developed as a practice through experience, and I highly recommend it to everybody. About the reviewers, very often when you submit a paper to a journal, they give you the opportunity to suggest some reviewers. I think some of you may have seen this in submission portals for journals. They say, do you want to suggest some reviewers? Now, what the editor will typically do when you suggest reviewers, they will assume that these are friendly reviewers. These are reviewers that you may have suggested because you think they will read the paper and think that it's a great paper. For whatever reason, maybe you presented it at a conference and somebody who's an expert came up and said, wow, that was a great piece of research. And you say, okay, they're an expert, they like this research, I'm going to suggest them as a review. You are completely within your rights to do that, right? So they will assume that. But I think, and I think Micah may be able to answer this and may be able to either affirm or contradict what I'm about to say. But it is very difficult for editors very often to find reviewers for papers, right? Because reviewing papers is a voluntary job, as I'm sure everybody in this room is. all the reviewers are incredibly busy, especially if they are accomplished researchers. They have a lot of things to do. And so they are often very picky about what papers they will agree to review, right? So I think editors would be very happy to take your suggestions, maybe even grateful, right? But they will probably not have your paper reviewed only by friendly reviewers. So, and they may even decide that, look, I'm not going to have any of these people review the paper because I don't want a friendly reviewer reading it. I want a neutral reviewer reading it who maybe doesn't know you, or, you know, whatever your link is with that person. So you're welcome to suggest it. Don't expect that it will go to them. But I don't think an editor would find it to be a problem. Maybe if you write a nice email saying, you know, I submitted my paper 9 months ago. I see that it has not yet gone out for review. In case you're having difficulty finding reviewers, here are some experts in the field who, you know, who may be appropriate reviewers for the paper. I think that's perfectly fine.
On that question, I don't really have anything to add on that point. I do a session. I've done many sessions of trying to understand the review process, the submission process from the perspective of an editor. So in 2016, I knew nothing about this stuff. I knew nothing about metrics. I knew nothing. But because of my partnership with Unhas, and we established a journal, I've had to learn what the pressures are from an editor. So I think that if you have the opportunity to be a reviewer, just raise a hand. Has anybody here been a reviewer? Please raise your hand. Has anybody been? So that's good. So a couple people, that's good. But going through the review process yourself is really helpful. So if you have the opportunity to do a review, I suggest that you do it, and it'll help you to understand what the submission process is. How about an editor? Is anybody listed on an editorial board of a journal? All right, Pat Yosef he's batting 1,000 here, as we say in baseball terms. But I would like to say that if you were able to put yourself in the shoes of an editor or a reviewer, it really helps you in the submission process. And so the questions that you're asking are really from the researcher perspective, right? The person that writes the paper and submits the paper. But it goes both ways. I can't tell you, as an editor, as a chief editor of a journal, it's not that the editors are always late in getting the reviewers and getting it back to the authors. It's also, once we submit a paper back to you, don't take 9 months to resubmit it back to the editor as well, right? It works both ways. Everybody's busy. Everybody has a lot going on. I don't have anything to add about what Professor Siddharth has said, but I do want to just broaden your thinking about how the overall picture works by saying that as soon as you do get that reviewer comments back, submit it within a month. Drop everything you're doing so that you make sure, because, you know, the currency of academia is very much driven by your publications. So you don't want to say, oh, I'll get to it in 3 months or 4 months and 5 months. We're always actually reaching out to authors themselves to say, hey, where's your submission? Please send it back to us. So I just want to give you into that consideration of how that process looks like. And I see lots of questions here based on the submission process. And I think that for the organizers, perhaps, you know, understanding the perspective from the editor would be really helpful for this group.
Pinkani, if I may, there were a couple. So did we properly respond to the second part of the first question, the collaboration? I collaborated on research with 3 more colleagues from different universities. We mentioned we recruited participants from our universities. That's fine. That's normal. There's no problem with that. You're not revealing the identities of the individuals. So it's ethical, and it's okay to say we recruited them from our university, right? Anyway, I just thought I'd respond to that because I don't recall whether we responded to the second question that the first person asked.
Okay, I think, yes, she also restated the questions. We didn't really understand the question. I think it has been answered then. So we can move on to the third question.
Another thing about the reviewers, I would say that as another thing of the perspective of an editor, when you get reviewers, sometimes, you know, I'll send out 10 10 emails saying, hey, will you review this? And I'll get 10 rejections. So if they ask for you to recommend 3 reviewers, give them 5, give them 6. And in the submission form, it's often like, oh, it's annoying. I have to find so-and-so's email address and put that in the form. And like, why do I have to do this? But if you don't do it, then all that difficult work that you're annoyed about doing, that falls on the editor. So what I'm trying to say is like, help them help you to make things easier, right? And the justifications of why you selected certain type of reviewers so that they don't think you're just trying to get the easy reviews passed through your system or your process too is also really helpful context.
Okay, thank you. Again, we can move on to the next question. Came from Yapina. The question is, how long can the data of research be considered expired for publication?
So I'm just going to jump in real quickly. I love these questions because a lot of them are ethical questions, and I think a lot of the issues around publishing revolve around ethics. But I do want to say that, you know, think about historians, right? Their data is really old. It's from a really, 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 really long time ago. So the question then becomes like, how do you decide what is data? And there's a lot of great writing, methods writing about what constitutes data, you know, whether and a lot of that again comes back to context specific. What is your field? What kind of research are you doing? What counts as data is very different from one field to another. And understanding the ethics of that and understanding the justification of it, I would actually really like to turn that question around and you to say why or why not does what you're asking constitute as data or not?
May I add? So I've published a paper, for example, on the 1918 influenza pandemic in Indonesia. So that's more than 100 years old, the data. And I think for the subject matter, it was perfectly appropriate because that was the topic of the paper. I think the question you may want to ask yourself is, what is the question I'm trying to answer? And does it matter how old my data are given the question that I'm trying to answer, right? That's the key issue here. And in my case, I was studying the 1918 pandemic. There's no escaping it. You need data from 1918 and Zaman Belanda, you know, so that's the data I used.
The other thing about data collection too that I'd like to add is that I can't tell you how many research groups go out and do a survey and collect data and never publish anything from that data. So the opposite question is also really important, right? Is it okay to leave that data that was collected behind, not analyzed? Because by not doing that, you're actually keeping something out of the literature, out of the record of different perspectives and analysis and time periods and all of those things too. So I think the onus is on, you go through a process, you get all the ethical clearances, you waste all these people's time to collect the data if you're a social scientist, for example, to then just put that into a drawer and not analyze it and not publish it also comes with its own risks, right? You don't want to just leave data untouched, right? That's important as well.
Okay, thank you once again. We have another question from chat box before we move on to Mbak Wiwi, who is raising her hand. So the question came from Maria Johanista. The question is, can references originating from the community and not yet published be also used as academic paper references?
So, I think if appropriate, again, the answer is it depends. What I definitely would not do is only rely on those kinds of references, because one of the things that reviewers will be looking for, when you cite something, they will be looking for the reliability of the citation, right? And one signal of how reliable a citation is that it went through a peer review process and experts in the field said, this is okay, we endorse it, right? So if all you have in your references is unrefereed material, then the reviewer might say, well, I don't know how much I can rely on all of these claims, right? But if you have maybe out of 30 references, 4 or 5 of them or 2 or 3 are unrefereed, I think that a reviewer might let that pass. So again, think about the context, but don't overpopulate your references with unreviewed work.
The other perspective from an editor's our perspective on that situation goes like this. If somebody is writing a research article and they submit it to our journal, we establish that journal. We are continuing the legacy of a journal of specific ideas that we think are important, that are really important to continue, right? So that jejak, right? The history, the things that came before, that came through that journal, came through there for a reason. People thought that they were important for a reason. And I can't tell you how many articles that I see submitted, whether I'm a reviewer or as an editor to the Forest and Society, that they don't even cite one paper from our journal. And that really, on the one hand, shows that why are you submitting it to our journal? The second is that we are also contingent on indexing systems that are related to the metrics of people citing the work from your journal, right? There's just a lot to say about this. First, you got to show your familiarity with the field. Second, you're also supporting the knowledge and conversation that have taken place in that journal, in those community of scholars that think certain issues are important. And so, yes, it's great, especially if you have really new research and access to data or writings or materials that haven't been seen before, but you need to make the connection with that lineage of that research tradition.
Okay. We'll move on to...
May I just say one thing? This is just to reemphasize a point that was made in that video presentation and to build on what Micah was saying. One of the things you need to do in your paper is show that you know the literature, right? And the references that you select are a way of signaling to the reviewer that you know what's going on, right? So the more comprehensive your references can be as they relate to the subject at hand, the more you are showing the reviewer that you know this material, and it sends kind of a, if not an overt signal, at least a subliminal signal to the reviewer that they can trust you, right? They can trust what you're saying.
Okay. Thank you. Bawiwi, I think you may now speak and ask the question.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to say thank you to all the committee. Thank you, Prof. Sidar, and thank you, Professor. Actually, I have one very tricky question that I want to share to you, and I need your suggestions. 2 years ago, I submitted my article entitled The Student Life Experience in Joining Online Learnings by Using Phenomenological Hermeneutic Research Design. I submitted that article in Qualitative Report. I believe that everyone knows that journal. 2 days after I submit my article, I get reply from the editor that my article will be sent to the reviewer. And after that, 1 month later, I got review, and there are so many notes from the reviewer. But I'm happy that I get a lot of information and a lot of knowledge from that. The most important point that I'm really confused is at the first time in the abstract, the first reviewer told me that I'm not, the research design that I applied in the research, in the article was not appropriate because I tried to use 2 research design that's about the narrative inquiry and also hermeneutic. But in the end of this note, the reviewer also apprised with the result finding, because I believe that they're interested with the finding. I sent again the reviewer the article that I have been revised, and I get I got a lot of notes again from them, and there is still again there is a design that I use, and I also revised again, and maybe 3 months ago I get the revision from them, and there is a minor suggestion that I have to improve, and however the process of revision is still ongoing, and in the third revision I sent again my article, and from the second review I was very surprised because more notes were given by the second reviewer, and he also tried to against the research design that I apply. And in the fourth process, in the fourth revisions, the chief editor told me that the article will never be able to be published in the journal because the research design was not appropriate with the journal. And one thing that I'm confused, I tried to do much on that article. I tried to improve, and the last revision, I tried to change the whole point in my article. I tried to change the research design and also the finding, but I'm not sure whether it will be accepted or not because it's almost 2 years, and the issue maybe is not really up to date. But I believe that the design that I do in the article was perfectly, as the research design suggested, like that. So I'm real dilemma whether should I send again the article to that journal, or maybe should I withdraw and I send to the other journal. But from the first until now, it needs 2 years. That is the point that I really want to know your suggestions, Prof. Thank you.
So I'm really sorry to hear that you're going through this, first and foremost, because, it's already been 2 years and time is very precious, especially if you're doing research that is time sensitive, right? It sounds to me like there were some issues with research design, right?
Yeah.
You tried to address them.
Yeah.
You sent it back.
Yeah.
They still found issues with research design. Then you got a set of reviews that said make minor revisions, which is great. So let me just back up and say at the outset, it sounds to me like the journal is actually interested in what you're working on, or they would not have sent this paper out so many times to so many reviewers, right? Because I think as Micah will tell you, editors have kind of a goodwill account with reviewers, right? And they don't want to overburden reviewers with work. The fact that the editor has chosen to actually send your paper out so many times and use up some of that goodwill with reviewers, I think is actually a very good sign. So that's the good news. I think sometimes what happens is when your paper goes out for multiple reviews, the editor may change the reviewers, right? So sometimes what can happen is they'll send it to some reviewers, they'll get reviews, and then they'll send the reviews to you, you'll fix the paper, then they'll send the paper back to those reviewers, and one of those reviewers may say, I'm sorry, this time I don't have time, right? And in that case, they'll find somebody else to review the paper and ask that reviewer, did this person adequately respond to the reviews, right? Now, when that happens, sometimes your paper gets opened up to additional criticisms from a different point of view, right? It may be that this is what happened at one of the stages in the review process. I just have a couple of suggestions because I don't know your subject well, and I don't know the details of the reviews. But one of the things to do is, I don't know if you've sat down with an expert in your university in the field or in a neighboring university and said, look, this is what I'm going through, right? Can you advise me on what to do, right? So sometimes having a conversation, because you are very focused on your paper, you're in the weeds, as we say, right? Your perspective sometimes may not be a bigger picture perspective anymore because you're stuck in the middle of the research. Sometimes bringing in a colleague whom you trust, who knows the subject, and sharing your material with them and saying, listen, these are the reviews, this is what the paper is, what should I do, right? They may give you some good advice. The other thing I want to recommend, because you believe that your research design is good, right, is sometimes, while I think it's important to bend over backwards to please the reviewers, especially if it doesn't cost you anything in terms of the findings of your paper or the research you've done, then I think it, if it comes at no cost to your research, then I think that your default approach should be do what the reviewer says. If it doesn't affect what's in the paper, just do what they say, right? It doesn't hurt anybody.
Yes.
If on the other hand, it's going to affect your research in some significant way, then you need to take a stand and you need to respond saying, I really appreciate, you obviously have to be nice and polite and everything. Thank you. Because they are doing you a favor by reading the paper. They're doing it for free. They're spending their time. So they're actually helping you build a much better research paper as a result. I think you need to respond to them saying, I really appreciate what you said. I think that, I have not made the changes that you suggested because, right? And give them the reasons. And then the other thing you may want to do is, given that it's already been 2 years and, you've been through 4 rounds of reviews, you may want to, at some point, contact the editor and say, I would very much like to get this paper published. Here are the reviews that keep coming back. In my opinion, I've addressed the ones that are important. In your opinion as editor, what would it take to move this paper to the next step, right? Ask them for their opinion, which points they think you should address and which points they are willing to give you a pass on, right? Sometimes that communication will help move your paper forward. So just a few thoughts. I've been through this. Oh, one last thing. Perseverance. The people who succeed in this profession are the people who persist. They get revised. They don't give up. They keep revising until it gets published. Don't give up.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Because, yeah. Thank you, Bro.
Mbak Wiwi,
And,
you have a question?
Thank you, Mbak Paulan. Yes.
Okay.
I want to add one thing just about reviewers. So I'm not in your field, so I don't really know those issues, the methods and the journal even. But what I would say is that the person that makes the decision on to publish is the editor. The reviewers don't. They make a recommendation, right? So it's always important to keep that in mind. And what happens is a lot of times one reviewer says something very different from another reviewer. So what you can do in those situations is use certain reviewers as justification to say, I followed the example of this reviewer that said this, this, and this, which is contradictory to the other reviewer. So what you were telling us was this one reviewer, and then I didn't really understand why it was minor revisions and then it became major revisions, or whether that was the same reviewer. But it's not in a journal's best interest to wait so long to publish something. They want to publish things as fast as possible too, right? So it's really unfortunate. It's just bad management, it sounds like, from that case, from that editor that was dealing with your paper that said, we want to publish this, and then dragged you along, because that's not good for you, but it's also not good for them. And the fact that there was this back and forth, and reviewers there's a whole ethics of reviewing as well that we should be aware of. And some reviewers are just really nasty. And I want you to encourage you all as well, if you get into a reviewer position, to really think in terms of having a culture of generosity, to really think in terms of constructive criticism. We are all in this together. We want people to succeed and get the best ideas out of their paper. And whatever they've written, they've spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, and we should respond accordingly. So sometimes you just get, there's a lot of jokes on Twitter about reviewer number 2. It's always reviewer number 2 kind of thing, right? So, but there's strategies to work to respond by talking about the differences between what reviewers have said. And usually 1 out of the 3 reviewers will say something extremely generous, and you need to communicate that to the editor as a way to help them make a decision, right? The editor does not want to contradict a reviewer, but the editor wants to publish your paper. And usually the reviewers contradict themselves, right, between each other. So it's just giving some more kind of perspective about how you choose to engage in that conversation with the editor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Wiwi. For the next question, Mas Cahyo, you may now speak and ask your question.
No, I just respond Pak Reemphasize, who is
Okay.
the reviewer in this room.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Okay, we're now moving on to the next question. Came from Chanuk Sayakti. The question is, 2 weeks ago, my paper was rejected after 2 years of waiting in line for review. I found that the comments from the reviewer were not related to my paper. Is it ethical to ask the reviewer directly?
My suggestion would be no. I have a suspicion that the reviewer either didn't know the subject or did not engage with your paper. You know, my suspicion is you will probably not gain anything from the process given the nature of the review. But you know, this 2-year thing, this is the second time I'm hearing about 2 years. As authors, you owe it to yourself not to let that happen. You need to, after 2 months maximum, you need to send a reminder to the journal saying very politely, I submitted my paper 2 months ago. I'd be very grateful for a status update. And let me tell you from personal experience, there is a journal, it's a well-known journal in the region in Southeast Asia, where I submitted a paper. I put a 2-month mark on my calendar. I wrote back, I said, what's going on? I did not receive a reply. 2 weeks later, I sent another email. I did not receive another reply. I pulled my paper and submitted it to another journal, a better journal, and it got published there. Okay. So, you know, if a journal is not being responsible, move on. Don't waste your time. Under no circumstances should you be wasting 2 years of having your manuscript sit with a journal without any movement in the process.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Nadila Puspa Arumujanarko also had a question, the same about 9 months waiting. Should I pull it? I would move your timelines way up, just like Prof. Siddharth was saying, right? Give them 2 months, and if they don't respond to your emails, you can go to their editorial board. And Indonesians are really good at shame, right? So you can say, hey, this editor, I submitted it. You said you were going to put it out to review, but what about the other editorial boards? How do you, members, I'm not getting a response. And if nobody's responding to my email, I'm going to pull my paper. And if you put 2 or 3 editors on there, there's a much higher likelihood they're going to respond to you. And if they don't respond to you, pull it right away, because you don't want to waste 2 years and you don't want to waste 9 months getting to the next stage of the reviews. And I would say that, yes, there's always this whole, the editors have too much to do. They don't respond to you. But, you go to the next journal, some editors are extremely fast and they're extremely responsive and they're really excited. And my experience with other editors is that they need papers, they need to publish, and they want submissions and they want to get those out really fast. So your job is to help them as much as possible to make those decisions quickly and efficiently. But if they're not doing their job, then there's many other journals in your field. There's indexing websites that you can go to see equivalent journals, look at who the people you're citing and see what they're publishing in. And that's definitely move up your timelines the way Prof. Siddharth was saying earlier.
And, more generally, you are your own best advocate, and sometimes you are your only advocate. So in terms of timelines, but also in terms of, when you get 4 different sets of reviews, you need to advocate for yourself with the editors on the journal.
Okay. Thank you so much once again. And the next question came from Bernardus Danibau. He's asking, Turnitin found 70% of my manuscript similar to my previous thesis. Is it still considered plagiarism, although I've never submitted it to any journals? Are there any solutions?
This is not plagiarism. It is widely accepted that early career scholars will convert their theses into publications. I would ignore all of the text that Turnitin highlighted that comes from your thesis, but I would pay close attention to the balance and make sure that that does not suggest that there's plagiarism occurring.
Okay, so just to add to that, that's exactly right. It is your work. It is your dissertation. It is supposed to be published. I think the opposite is a much bigger problem. People write theses and dissertations and don't submit it and get it published to a journal. That's the bigger problem, right? But you can definitely take whatever you wrote in your thesis or dissertation. I think for my field and any field that I've ever known, that is basically expected of you. And you can turn that into a publication. Even now what you have is, the 3-paper rule for dissertations, where each empirical chapter or theoretical chapter is anticipated to become a journal article. So I wouldn't worry about that. The bigger problem is that you take a chapter of your thesis and you submit it to a journal, and it's not a cohesive argument, right? Because you have an introduction that has the entirety of the argument, and one of your chapters is just part of that argument. So you need to do the kind of work that makes sure that it fits the formats of that journal. It needs to change it so that the research question is specific and is completely answered within that journal article that you're submitting. But taking materials from your thesis or dissertation for publication in a journal article is what is expected of you. And I would say the other, for people who are writing for books, that's, it's the same kind of thing. It's a dissertation is written for your committee members, right? But if you're thinking of taking your thesis or dissertation and wanting to write a book out of it, there's also things that you need to change, even though the bulk of that material can remain close.
Okay, thank you. He also actually posted another question. The question is, the editor suggested some journal links to transfer my script. What should I do?
Oh, the other thing is, I would say that if you are submitting, you need to say that as well, right? Because good journals take your information and they'll put it into Turnitin, and they'll see the 70% similarity and they'll outright reject you, and they'll send you a nasty letter saying, if you do plagiarism, you are jeopardizing your entirety of your career. So what you need to say is, part of this or sections of this were taken from my thesis in your cover letter that you submit to that journal. Sorry, I didn't make that explicit earlier.
And also, if I may add to what Micah said, obviously you need to cite your thesis, right? So that it's very, very clear that this came from something that you had done earlier.
Okay, for the second question about the editor suggested some journal links to transfer my script, what should I do? He asked.
I'll tell you what I would do. I would take a look. So it seems like what the editor is suggesting is that your paper is not a very good fit for the journal that they edit, but they think it would be a good fit for another, usually a related journal, if they are suggesting that you transfer it. So this is actually a very, in some ways, it's a good sign, because the editor is that your paper be sent out for review through the network of a related journal, right? So you've kind of got at least the beginnings of an endorsement from an editor. That's a great thing. What I would do is I would look at the journals that the editor has suggested. I would go through the process that I suggested in the video that hopefully you watched, for seeing, whether your paper is a good fit for one or more of the journals. I would look at the quality of the journal as well. Ideally, you want to get your papers published in the highest quality journal in which it's feasible to publish that paper, and then I would make the decision. But there's nothing wrong with transferring your manuscript to a journal per se, to another journal.
Scope is really important. So I run a journal called Forest and Society. It's only about Southeast Asia. So when I get a journal about, like, shifting cultivation in Ghana, we just send an outright rejection and we say, here are some other equivalent journals that you should think about. So the reason that editor might be suggesting other journals is because they probably read through it very quickly and said, this is a good article, but doesn't fit with the scope of our journal. So make sure you double check scope.
Okay, so the next question came from Sri Supia Cahyati. She said, I'd like to submit a conceptual-based research entitled Incorporating Digital Interactive Multimodal English Books for the Alpha Generation to Strengthen Digital Literacy. The thesis statement is that the digital interactive multimodal books integration can stimulate all 5 senses while the students read it, enhancing the learning experience. Yet, there are currently few studies on the use of digital books for young learners in Indonesian context. Is it worth it to be published on an international journal? Your suggestion, please. Thank you.
As a matter of principle, it sounds like a great idea. It's very timely. These methods of education are being more widely deployed. So not having read the paper, I think the topic is probably an interesting one. And there are probably education journals that would be very interested in this. Your other route, maybe if there are particular subjects on which the materials you're talking about focus, is to submit it to a journal that covers those subjects. But it sounds to me like something in the field of education may be the most appropriate.
This is a great question here, and I have a lot to say about it. And this is something that early career authors tend to do a lot. It's like I get an article about let's use shifting cultivation practices in Desa. Sorry. In Desa Ujung Bulu, Kecamatan Tompu Bulu in Provinsi, whatever, right? So yes, you're making a case for novelty. You're saying that nobody has done this research before. But the question about nobody having done this research before, does that matter? Maybe nobody's done that research before because not that many people in that context are interested in it, right? The empirical findings from one specific village, does that make it worth additional publication in a specific outlet? I hope I'm making myself clear. I want to connect it to this specific abstract. So you're saying that digital literacy is a really important topic, but nobody's writing about it in Indonesia. And so what you need to do to strengthen that is to say why specific empirical material from Indonesia is important in that context. If you're able to do that, yes, of course, we want to hear more about why it's different or specifically beneficial in a place like Indonesia. But just because you're saying that digital literacy hasn't been done before in Indonesia, well, maybe we know enough about digital literacy and its pedagogical engagements from other contexts. Again, not my field. I'm just kind of guessing here. But what you need to do a little bit more, in my estimation, is if it's a journal that's an Indonesia-focused journal on education, that sounds like it would be perfect, even if it was something on Southeast Asia. But my sense is, for those interested in digital literacy, whatever the top global journals in that topic is, you're going to need to make a little bit stronger of a case about why Indonesia is so important. Now, it might be because it's the 4th largest country in the world by population, and there are some unique dimensions to digital literacy happening in Indonesia. You see how that slight twist makes it that much more interesting now. So try to think a little bit more in those terms, and I hope that actually relates to a lot of people, because it's a really common thing that I see, that people who aren't as confident about their research say, well, I know my one place really well, so I'm just going to keep it there. Whereas editors and new kind of breakthroughs in science are really looking at how does that specific case study that you know really well connect to these bigger conversations that we're having all over the world, and that are really very interesting to the people who spend a lot of time studying this specific topic.
So I do want to qualify the answer that I gave before, Micah. I hadn't read the abstract, and I was just thinking in general, the topic sounds like an interesting one. And I assume that what you're finding is generalizable, right? I think the keyword that Micah also was, one of the keywords he was getting at was generalizability, right? The more generalizable your findings are to any context, the more likely a top journal is going to be interested in publishing it, because it will appeal not just to people who work on education in Indonesia, but people who work on education generally, right? Hence the generalizability term.
Okay, thank you once again. I think, unfortunately, we are very running out of time now. We're sorry we have to close the Q&A session for today. And I would like to say once again, thank you to Professor Siddharth and Dr. Micah for a very insightful sessions, and also all of the participants for your engagement. I believe that we learned something new today that will help us in the quest on publishing in international academic journal. So before we bring this YouTube live session to a close, furthermore, we'd like to extend our gratitude to Henry Luce Foundation, whose support and dedication have played a crucial role in making this event possible. Their commitment to fostering academic excellence is truly commendable. On behalf of the organizing team, we thank you once again for your active participation and look forward to seeing you in our future events. Thank you and see you. So for the workshop participant, we will now